Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking an absolute economic earthquake. I want you to imagine a giant map of North America. Maybe picture it crafted out of one of those sweeping, intricate macaroni art mosaics from grade school. Now imagine that map suddenly shaking, borders shifting, and everything fusing into one massive interconnected web of trade. That's exactly what we're looking at today, the meteoric rise and the eventual fall of a treaty that fundamentally reshaped our entire continent, NAFTA. Okay, let's dive into this. January 1, 1994. That date marked a defining moment in modern economics because it's the exact day the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was implemented. With just the stroke of a pen, the United States, Canada, and Mexico essentially merged into one of the largest free trade zones in human history. It was a landmark, highly controversial economic treaty with one main goal: systematically wiping out taxes on imports and exports across the entire North American continent. To really understand this colossal shift, we're going to take a quick continental tour. We'll kick things off with the NAFTA Master Plan, then explore the polarized economic impacts, the boom and bust in the U.S., the export explosion and migration down in Mexico, and energy and disputes up in Canada. Finally, we'll tally up the continental balance sheet before looking at the USMCA upgrade. Section 1, the NAFTA Master Plan, integrating North America. So before we look at the wildly different outcomes, we have to understand the grand 1994 design. The core ambition here was to integrate three very distinct economies, but with minimal government friction. To pull that off, the architects laid out three main objectives. First up, eliminate tariffs. They planned to systematically phase out customs duties on industrial goods, agricultural products, and textiles over a 15-year window. Picture a steady, unimpeded stream of goods, just like those animated macaroni noodles on our mental map, seamlessly crossing borders. Second, protect intellectual property. This meant setting up strong, uniform legal shields for patents, trademarks, and copyrights across all three nations. And third, streamline investment. The goal here was straightforward: remove restrictions on foreign investment so that U.S. and Canadian companies could build factories and invest directly in Mexico without running into discriminatory local laws. Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. United States. Boom and bust. Winners and losers. You see, NAFTA impacted each country in profoundly different ways, and it created a stark divide across American industries. On one hand, the treaty was a massive boon for U.S. agriculture, especially for stuff like corn, soybeans, and meat exports heading into Mexico. It also really helped high-tech sectors. And for the everyday citizen, economists praise the treaty for lowering consumer costs on everything from groceries to automobiles by integrating supply chains. But the negatives hit certain communities incredibly hard. The treaty heavily incentivized American manufacturing companies, especially in the automotive and textile industries, to just close up their factories in the U.S. Rust Belt and relocate to Mexico. Why? To capitalize on significantly lower labor costs. 750,000. Just take a moment to let that number sink in. While economists were focusing on the lowered prices at the grocery store, labor unions fiercely blamed the treaty for the destruction of American livelihoods. This massive number represents the estimated high end of U.S. manufacturing jobs lost to those shifting supply chains. It really brings those trillion-dollar macroeconomic benefits we hear about down to a stark human reality for the working class. Moving south, Section 3, Mexico, maquiladoras, and migration, the export explosion. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the impacts on Mexico were equally dramatic, but entirely different in nature. It was all driven by one specific concept: maquiladoras. Basically, these are duty-free factories that assemble goods specifically for export. Driven by NAFTA, Mexico developed a robust manufacturing base largely centered around these maquiladoras, especially right along the northern border. Inside these bustling factories, Mexican manufacturing exports surged by literally hundreds of %, completely transforming the region's industrial capacity. And fascinatingly, this happened even as overall foreign direct investment into the country plummeted. But much like the U.S., Mexico experienced a really sharp economic duality. The positive, as we just saw, was the rapid, historic development of that robust manufacturing export base. The negative side of the ledger, though, was absolutely devastating for rural communities. The sudden influx of heavily subsidized U.S. corn completely flooded the Mexican market, which drastically undercut local prices. This dynamic devastated Mexico's small-scale agricultural sector. It is a textbook case of economic cause and effect rippling across borders. 1.3 million. That's the staggering estimated number of small-scale Mexican farmers who were displaced by the collapse of local agricultural prices. And look, this massive economic displacement didn't just happen in a vacuum. It inadvertently became a primary driver for a huge wave of undocumented migration from Mexico into the United States throughout the late 1990s and 2000s. The economies were so intertwined that a shift in one specific sector echoed powerfully right across the border. Let's pivot north for Section 4, Canada, Energy and Disputes, Northern Integration. So how did the final piece of the puzzle integrate into this massive continental network? Well, Canada faced its own dual reality. On the positive side, trade with the U.S. absolutely skyrocketed, specifically in the automotive, energy, and mineral sectors. Canada successfully wove its manufacturing right into the broader continental web. But on the flip side, Canadian workers faced intense competition from that booming, low-wage Mexican manufacturing sector we were just talking about. On top of that, Canada struggled with some highly controversial investor-state dispute clauses. These were unique legal provisions that allowed corporations to literally sue the Canadian government over environmental regulations if they felt those laws harmed their corporate profits. Crazy, right? Section 5. The Continental Balance Sheet. Adding it all up. So, the crucial point is, when we bring these three geographic perspectives together and look at the massive overall tally, the scale is just staggering. Take a look at the top row. Total continental trade volume went from a baseline of roughly $290 billion back in 1993 to over $1.2 trillion post-NAFTA. I mean, that is an explosive, roughly 4 times expansion in trade. We also see Mexico's gross domestic product crossing the $1.2 trillion mark, driven heavily by those maquiladora exports. But then, look at the middle row. U.S. manufacturing employment dropped significantly, falling from about 17 million jobs down to roughly 12 million by the late 2010s. The macroeconomic growth of the continent was totally undeniable, but the localized pain in specific sectors was very, very deep. But I have to ask you, was this 1994 treaty actually ready for the modern digital economy? I mean, think back to 1994. The internet was barely a novelty. By the 2010s, e-commerce was completely dominating global trade. NAFTA was increasingly viewed as totally outdated, failing to account for how modern business was actually being transacted. Which leads us to Section 6, the USMCA upgrade, a new era of trade. Because it lacked modern digital rules or updated labor standards, NAFTA drew intense criticism over the years, including from President Donald Trump, who famously called it the worst trade deal ever signed. This intense political pressure forced a complete renegotiation. As a result, tracking the timeline here, the 1994 treaty was officially terminated and replaced on July 1, 2020, by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which we commonly know as the USMCA. And this brilliantly illustrates how grand economic treaties evolve. It wasn't a total teardown, it keeps the core tariff-free framework completely intact, but it injects much stricter rules into the system. For instance, it requires a higher percentage of automobile parts to be made right here in North America. Crucially, and this is to address those localized job losses we talked about earlier, it mandates that a significant portion of auto parts must be built by workers earning at least $16 an hour. It also completely updates intellectual property laws for the modern internet era, and it grants U.S. dairy farmers increased access to the highly protected Canadian market. Which brings us to a final, lingering question for you to think about. With these stricter rules in place and a massive $1.2 trillion trade baseline to build on, who will be the new winners and losers in North America's next economic chapter? Because as these new USMCA mandates ripple through the continental supply chain, they're going to inevitably reshape industries, everyday prices, and your own wallet in the years to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.